Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for today's program. Religion and politics, always a controversial mix, and is especially so in the year of a presidential election. Again, in 1988, as in 1984 and 1980, the religious factor has been playing a particular role in the fall campaign. This year, that interaction between these two aspects of American life, religion and politics, were visibly represented at the time of the Democratic Convention, with the Reverend Jesse Jackson's participation. And again at the Republican Convention, when the Reverend Pat Robertson spoke of the G word, that is, the God word. Whatever the legal separation of church and state has meant in the history of this republic, it's certainly not included the compartmentalization of religion and life. Today, as the 1988 election is upon us, we'll be identifying the religious issues in this presidential campaign, how these are different or similar to those in the past, and interpret their impact from an Austin vantage point. And helping us in our analysis is Valerie Bridgman Davis, religion editor of the Austin American-Statesman, and Max Sherman, dean of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. And we welcome you both. And I'd like first, Max, as one who has been around on elections before, compare 1988 with the preceding elections in terms of what are the religious issues as you see them?
Rich, I think that for me personally, I have to go back and look at the 1960 election just briefly, and that was the issue where the nation focused on the Catholicism of President Kennedy, or then candidate Kennedy, and that issue was resolved, but it focused on the particular religious group to which he was attached. And then in 1976, of course, when Jimmy Carter was a candidate, and it focused on the fact that he was a very committed, born-again Christian. And then as you shifted into the 80s, you pick up the moral majority and the organization of a number of groups. A lot of churches were involved, a lot of ministers were involved, and it was a force in what happened. It seems to me that that focused less on the particular religious persuasion of the individual, because many people did not know and do not know today what religious affiliation that President Reagan has, and yet they associate him with those issues, and positively. And it seems to me that I would call those religious political issues different than they were earlier. And then I would just have to say very briefly, just in this introduction, that it seems to me that in Austin there's a very fundamental issue, and a lot of people would take it, the image that they have of the individual candidates, Dukakis and Bush, whether or not they really understand our society, they appreciate the problems of our society, which I think at the base of it for many is a religious issue.
Okay, so as you turn our attention to the local area, I think this is where, Valerie, you can be of particular help to us, because as the religion editor of the Austin American-Statesman, you're in touch with the pulse of your readership, and can you share with us anything that you found in that regard?
I think people would like to think that's true. But one of the things that I've noticed among the religious community here in Austin is it's a very distinct community. There are two distinct communities in Austin. One is very, for lack of a better word, liberal, social actions-oriented group of people, would probably be mainliners, Presbyterians, Methodists, Christian church people. And then there's another segment of this community which is very fundamentalist, inerrant people, literalists, would be our Pentecostals, Charismatics, and even Southern Baptists, I guess, would go in that group. And the issues for both of those groups are different. I think Max and I were talking earlier about one group would be really concerned with peace issues, that would be the liberal groups, and they would not be as concerned about homosexuality, where the fundamentalist group would be real concerned about abortion, homosexuals, prayer in school, that kind of issue. So there appears to be two different groups of religious people in Austin.
Well, now, wouldn't you think that that same kind of division would apply to other places in the country as well, that you have those that are concerned about what might be called the social agenda, and those who would define religion in terms that would relate to the peace issue and matters of discrimination and justice and so on.
I think that's true, but in Austin, there seems to be, I want to say also, Austin is a pocket. I think that Austin is very different than Dallas, or very different than San Antonio here in Texas. Texas has a reputation of being a very conservative state. And although that is true, Austin seems to be, because it is an intellectual group of people, more attentive to not only their own belief systems, but what everyone else is doing as well.
All right.
I think that's more true here than maybe Dallas, for instance.
So the presence of the university and Max, perhaps even the presence of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs has some difference here.
I think that there's no doubt that that's affected it a great deal. Probably even the more conservative churches are not as conservative as their counterparts would be in other parts of the state or in other parts of the country. And I think the people who come here to speak, the issues that are viewed on programs such as this, cause a heightened awareness of these issues, an analysis of them, trying to figure out where people come from, and it probably is a much more open, I mean, people are more they accept other people's views much more easily.
Yeah.
I guess if you found some of that in those studies.
I think that's true. I think that as I listen to I've talked to some real conservative people here in this city, things that may have been war words before, they are now reticent to make them declarations now.
The war words, you mean what?
Abortion, women in ministry, things like that, that may not on the face of them seem political. But when they mesh them into their total lives, they base their political decisions on their worldview, how they want their religion to play into their world.
Well, let's come back to this presidential election particularly. And I'd like to just have us reflect for a moment, both from an Austin perspective and maybe even from a larger one, about something like the pledge to the flag. Here we are in 1988. We have become a debtor nation. We have accumulated more debt in the last, during this last decade than in all the preceding history of the Republic. There's the economic problems of a major sort, the deficit, and all of these kinds of things in the campaign up to this point has been very much on the back burner, and up front is something like the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I'd like to see to what extent that really is a religious issue. It has this kind of a social agenda type character to it, it seems like. And can you speak to either of you to how that might be perceived as part of this matter?
I think that it actually comes in the Supreme Court decisions out of the fact that you had a religious group, Jehovah's Witness group, that indicated that it was improper for them because of their religious tenets to recite the pledge. And they raised the issue that their children should not be required to do that. There are many decisions of the Supreme Court that actually came out of the Jehovah's Witness faith. And the court said that even though it may be a minority group, that the First Amendment says that you have that right not to be forced to do that. And so it is, at the base of it, a religious issue. That part of it has probably been sublimated to that it's not recognized as that, but that actually goes to the very First Amendment of the Constitution.
It may have come as a surprise to a number of people in the electorate that there would be any resistance to having people say the pledge to the flag, or that decision was sometime several decades back and had more or less been forgotten, but that at the root of it, it had a religious First Amendment motivation. And the Supreme Court has been rather clear that we can't force people to take that pledge. And yet it's become a hot campaign issue.
And a very volatile one. I mean, I think it's, it probably has done the most recent information politically is that it probably has shifted the polls several points in favor of Vice President Bush over these last several days. Rich, I think another issue that we didn't discuss earlier as we were looking at this, but the prayer decision, the original prayer decision was basically one that said that a unit of government cannot tell us what we must pray, which the New York Board of Regents tried to do to prescribe a prayer. And it goes to the heart again of if a government can tell you what to do or which prayer to say, then they can go farther and tell you other things. And the court said you cannot do that because government, this is not the business of government, that the religious issue is something far more fundamental.
The thing that strikes me is that the place that the groups that I talk about, two polar groups, would come together would be on this issue, because I think that the religious people in Austin would see that as a not just freedom for religion, but freedom from religion. And I don't think they want that. Now, the problem in Austin, of course, is that we have a very vocal atheist group who makes a point of pointing out to us that constitutional amendment, this is not a religious society, but a democratic society. And the backlash from that, from the religious community in Austin and in other places, would be that our Constitution guarantees us religious rights as well as freedom from religion. And I think that that would be the bottom line, at least in Austin, as I understand the people here on that issue.
And the fact that you have, how do you go about getting your soundings, by the way, of where people are coming from in terms of their opinions and religious views?
I get some interesting mail. I get some real interesting mail, and people react to some of the stories. They react to some of the notes that run at the bottom of the stories. And then sometimes people just call me because they want to sound off to somebody about what's happening in the city, and nobody else is listening. And so when I'm at my desk, that's kind of what I do, fill those calls.
If they can't get a hold of the preacher, they call you.
If they can't get a hold of the preacher, they call me. And the other thing I do is I call around. I check with little heard from groups of people and just ask them, you know, what are you thinking about this issue or that issue? The last and most recent has nothing to do with the presidential election, but the last Temptation of Christ, I got a bombarding group of calls, and so then that prompted me to go make some other calls, and I talked to a fairly good sized group of people just to know what was happening. So that's kind of how I sound out the community and know their concerns and know what they're
Well, that's helpful to have that background. And I think that one thing that, just to finish up on a thought that we suggested earlier about what really constitutes religious issues, maybe apart from what the common opinion is, but what would be from the standpoint of, I know what Jim Wall in the Christian Century, as he writes his columns and editorials recently, said, it seems like religious issues are such things as prayers in school, or Michael Dukakis having married a divorced woman and therefore not being able to take the sacrament in his Greek Orthodox church, that the public has a kind of an immediate identification. Yes, that's religion. But what about nuclear weapons? What about matters of immigration policy, Central America? How do you, Max, as a leader in the field of public affairs, how do you define a religious issue?
Of course, I think that those issues that you mentioned at the end are the ones that seem to me that spring out of religious faith. I'm a Presbyterian, and I think that the various things that we study, the hunger issue, that there are people that cannot feed themselves. I think even the illiteracy issue is a religious issue, that there are people that can't work because they can't function in our society. And as we get more technical, and that's very fundamental about the worth of a human being, and that my religion tells me that each individual is important, and that as a society we've got to do that. And I think that I come out of West Texas, and I held elective office in West Texas, and I think that people in the small communities, and I think the kinds of groups you were mentioning, Valerie, that you talk to, they do care that the people they elect, and I think the people they elect to the office of president, that this is a caring person. Now, so far, we haven't gotten those indications. This campaign has not helped us know that, but I think a lot of people would like to have a better sense of how these people feel, who they are.
So the feeling of whether they're caring, whether they share common values, whether they have a sense of what are the fundamental worth of both the individual and, I presume, in matters of environment, the future of the planet, All of that, in your view, has religious, moral implications.
Well, I think very deep ones, and I think
And that compared to that, maybe some of the things that are labeled religious issues are not nearly as significant in their long-range import.
I think people who take those things seriously, you mentioned the nuclear weapon issue, I think any a person who's been in Sunday school classes and you studied, you always struggle with this thing about the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Well, obviously we've worked out ways that there are certain exceptions to that. We defend our country, and it's very important. How do we do that? And even if you agree with the decision, you've agonized over it. And I think I would just like to know that there is a president that will agonize over these issues. I may not agree with the decisions, but that person is concerned about it, loses sleep about it.
I'd like to get your reaction to one other publication. Valerie, maybe you can respond to this first. This is the Texas Observer that just arrived recently. It's called Faith and Politics, and it is a report on the Texas Republicans in New Orleans. It shows a person with a placard that said, "Bush will win because God is a Republican." Now, I don't want you to get into heavy theological response to that, but what's been your, just turning away from the moment to your reaction from the public, but your own conviction about the extent to which you can identify God with any party, Democrat or Republican?
I've decided that I hope that God is neither Democratic or Republican. I said to you earlier, I'm an independent. I have to be convinced that any candidate, whether they're Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, whatever, will meet my needs, my belief systems, help me to know that they're going to be responsible public officials. And that becomes the way I decide who gets to be my president. I really hope God is not Republican or Democratic, but I recognize that there are a lot of people who identify their religious systems with a particular political system. That to me is very scary because I see good and evil in both camps.
Let's just take as an example. We had two pastors, two reverends at each of the conventions. Pat Robertson at the Republican, Jesse Jackson at the Democratic. Was there really any difference from your point of view in terms of how they brought religion into play in regard to the political process?
I think so. And I don't want to seem like a Jesse Jackson yahoo here, but I think the difference is that Jesse Jackson has always billed himself as a statesman and a spokesman for the underclass, kind of cheerleader for those who are disenfranchised. Whereas Pat Robertson comes from a very upper middle class background, 700 Club. His affiliation with the underclass is through receiving their money through their gifts and offerings on television, and that's, I hope that didn't sound like an indictment. It's just two different experiences for the candidates. And they even talk about God differently. They talked about God differently in the campaigns. Jesse Jackson has been accused of being Marxist because he thinks that God is on the side of the underdog. Pat Robertson, instead of talking about underdogs, thinks that the underdogs are really the winners and that they just look like underdogs, but God's on their side, and so they just appear to be underdogs. They're not really underdogs. So his religion seems to be more upper middle class. Jesse Jackson comes from a different perspective. So when they talk, their politics from their religious perspective is different.
Okay. Do you have any feeling about that?
Which I think that there are two similar. There's at least one major similarity, and that is that the religious identification that they each had gave them one distinct political advantage in that it cut across state lines, and it gave them at least an entree into various communities because they were known and they were identified. Now what they did with that is something else, and I think that's one of the major points of departure. And I think another issue is that because of what we mentioned a little bit earlier, in 1980 and 1984, in the moral majority and its support for Ronald Reagan in a very, very active way, is that the Republican Party has a very, very difficult issue of how they deal with that issue. I think that in
that issue being the moral majority.
The moral majority, because it was a key factor in the success, and they don't want to alienate the group, and yet they're afraid to embrace the group. And I think we saw that frustration as they tried to come to grips with that, and it's still with them, and they will probably continue to struggle with it as they go forward, because it was a very important piece of that puzzle.
And it's the same tension, in a sense, reverse side, with the Democratic Party having an ongoing tension with the Reverend Jesse Jackson because of his perception that they're not moving as aggressively in regard to the issues of the underclass. I mean, each party has its own tension with its own reverends.
I think the difference, though, for me at least, between Pat Robertson and Mr. Jackson was that although Jackson is a religious man, he chose to embrace people who were not necessarily religious. Farmers, other people who were struggling, who did not identify themselves as religious. Mr. Robertson obviously was going for the religious right, and that made a difference, I think, in the power that each brought into their political arena.
All right. Well, I think that because we are approaching the election where it's Dukakis and Bush, and Jackson and Robertson playing supportive or contributing roles at the most at this stage, let's, in the time that we have left, zero in particular on what the religious factor may mean as we are making this decision within a matter of days of having to cast our ballot. And if we have concurred, as I think we have, that God is neither Republican nor Democrat, and that we can't tie our particular faith and say that's our position on abortion is God's will, or our position on the environment is God's will. I'd like to get your reaction to one statement made by a fellow named Arthur Simon. He's head of an organization called Bread for the World, visitor in Austin soon, and he is also one who has said in a book on public policy and faith that you have to accept the fact that in the Bible you don't have a foreign policy. You don't have an economic policy. What you have is a direction. And people take from the Bible their sense of direction in regard to public issues. Do you think that's a general fair statement about what faith will mean for church people, religious folk, as they make their decisions in regard to the presidential election?
I think it's a fair statement, and I think that it indicates the difficulty, because it's not one that's easily identified as to what is the religious position on these issues. I think the patriotic issue, both parties, both candidates have tried to capture it by having the flags in the background and to say that, to cloak themselves in the flag, and it would be both parties. There is no symbol that cuts across all of the religious communities, because we have different symbols. And so you can't as easily do that. So, and I think because of the two reverends, and I'll just be very brief, that people have backed away somewhat from those issues. At one time, the prayer issue might have done it, but no longer, it seems to me, people are staying away. And that what they may seek is that very thing, is whatever my religious persuasion, that for this particular candidate, I feel that he will be able to articulate my faith. Foreign policy, whatever, that in doing those things that I think a person should do, not very concretely, but in an overall policy direction. So I would agree with what Simon says.
And to articulate a person's faith, not in terms of as a Presbyterian or as a Buddhist or whatever sectarian view may be, but my fundamental values, what Paul Tillich may have called an ultimate concern.
Correct.
Is that what
I
you
think
meant
so,
about that?
absolutely.
Okay. Do you think that Arthur Simon's view about the role of religion in public affairs is a good summary?
I think it's an accurate assessment. I think that I want to go back to something Mr. Sherman said, that we want someone who is going to agonize over decisions, whether we agree with the decision or not. And I think that the religious community, myself included, will agonize as we go push buttons on Election Day. I'm going to go knowing that whoever is president come January will not be making all those decisions by himself. And I want to say thanks be to God to that. I want to be glad that they're going to be a cabinet. And so I want to vote for someone who can pull together a team that will make those kinds of decisions based, I hope, on fundamental values and make a difference in not only the United States but the rest of the world. And I think that that is what's going to happen all over Austin come Tuesday.
And I think that what we have, too, in terms of the appreciation of the dilemma that whoever is elected is going to be in, that you can always be sure of praying bipartisan prayers, that if Dukakis wins, the Republicans in that land will be called upon to pray for his success, because as he prospers, so will we all. If Bush wins, the Democrats will need to be in the prayer mode as well. And I think we have just 4 or 5 seconds here yet.
Let me just say, I think you go back to the First Amendment that you asked about earlier. Whichever president is there to preserve the right of each of us to worship as we choose, I think is so fundamental for our democracy.
Thank you, Max. And thank you, Valerie. As we bring our discussion to an end, we wish to thank our guests and for you for watching today. The whole community of persons in whatever party and of all faith traditions are grateful for the sharing of these thoughts that has been with us. We'd like to ask you again to join us next week on Austin Faith Dialogue as our series continues. I'm Richard Thompson. Thank you for watching.